Hello and welcome, my name is Divine Disaster, this is Battlefield 1, and in today's video we're going to be taking a closer look at the Automatico M1918, looking at the stats of the weapon, how they perform, as well as each individual preset available in Battlefield 1. Starting off, as we always do with weapon reviews, with the stats of the weapon in question, and as baseline, before we look at all three variants, we're going to look at the Automatico M1918. It comes with a maximum damage of 23, minimum damage of 12, giving you a 5-shot kill in close quarter. No surprise there, as it is an SMG available to the assault class. Rate of fire record high at 900 rounds per minute, giving it a clear advantage of pretty much anything other than a shotgun in close quarters. A limited magazine size, nevertheless plentiful for at least 2 targets at 25. An abysmal muzzle velocity at 380 as to be expected from an SMG. When it comes to reload times, they're actually pretty good, pretty competitive, especially the short reload at 2.1 seconds. The long reload at 2.8 isn't too bad, nevertheless still should be avoided in close quarter scenarios where you're trying to deal with multiple targets or one target after another. We move on then to recoil, where the M1918 factory sports a vertical recoil of 0.4, a horizontal recoil of 0.6, and a first shot recoil multiplier at 2.33. Hefty recoil here, that's no surprise given that this is the FAMAS of Battlefield 1, especially that first shot recoil multiplier you should pay attention to, but also the horizontal recoil clearly limits the distance at which you can use this weapon effectively. We move on then to spread with a base ADS value of 0.3, an ADS value while moving of 0.5, and hipfire while standing and moving at 1.5. This weapon is typical for an SMG, quite good at hip firing, has a decent base ADS but a very poor first shot spread multiplier, both hip and ADS. First shot spread multiplier at 6, meaning that your weapon very quickly will be a lot less accurate than it initially is, and a spread increase per shot of 0.045. What you do need to be aware of when using SMGs in Battlefield 1 is of course that while the spread may be initially quite low, it very quickly already on the second shot jumps quite significantly upwards, almost doubling in the case of the Automatico M1918, and from that point onwards slowly increases, so is in effect, other than on the first shot, quite bad to begin with, limiting your effective engagement distance to close quarters, maybe medium range, but certainly nothing long range. Having then looked at the base stats of the Automatico, specifically those of the M1918 factory, we move to the comparative element, looking also at the Storm variant of the Automatico and of course the Trench variant. And the first difference that these three variants have is in the recoil department. In the case of the Automatico M1918 Storm, instead of the vertical recoil of 0.4 found on both the factory and Trench preset, and the horizontal recoil of 0.6 found both on the Trench and factory preset, here you have lower recoil, 0.28 for the vertical and 0.48 for the horizontal. And while there is still quite a lot of recoil to deal with on the Storm, especially horizontal recoil, which of course you cannot compensate for, this weapon is easier to control quite significantly and is thus much better at ADS played compared to the other two weapons. Other than the base recoil values, there's further differences between these variants. In the case of the factory, you have a recoil decrease, that is how quickly your recoil decreases, of 16 versus the Automatico and Trench's value of only 8, meaning that the factory recovers from its recoil twice as fast as the other two variants. Furthermore, the factory has a better first shot recoil multiplier. The previously mentioned value of 2.33 on your first shot is significantly less than the first shot recoil multiplier of the Automatico Storm and Trench preset, which have a first shot recoil multiplier of 2.8. Lastly, then we have a couple of differences in the spread department of the stat, with the Automatico Trench obviously having the better hipfire values. It actually has a hipfire at 0.667 for all hipfire scenarios other than standing and moving simultaneously. There its hipfire in the Trench preset is 1.001, which is of course much better than the hipfire of the factory or Storm presets, which comes in at 1.5 or 1 respectively. Another difference to note here is the first shot spread multiplier, while identical when it comes to ADS across all variants, is different when it comes to the hipfire first shot spread multiplier. In the case of the Automatico Trench, this is 1, meaning that while it is still less accurate in its hipfire state on first or second shot when compared to ADSing both the Trench or any of the other Automaticos, it isn't anywhere close to as inaccurate on its second and consecutive shots than the Automatico Storm or factory factories are after being hip fired, they jump in accuracy quite significantly, as all variants do when being fired in ADS. The last difference to note here is spread decrease. The amount of degrees per second your spread decreases after your weapon stops firing. In the case of the factory, once more we have better values here at 4.05 versus the storm and trench presets 2.7. With these stats then out of the way, let's move on to how this weapon performs on the battlefield and how you should try to use it. Now generally the Automatico, all three variants discussed in today's video, is obviously a close quarter beast. It does very poorly at medium range, at long range, but does extremely well at close quarters. The best way to obviously use this is in close quarters and likely with a bit of AD spam, so moving constantly back and forth even while firing in close quarters. If you're using the factory or storm preset, this may not be quite so good for the close medium range targets, but we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk once more about the three variants and how they differentiate themselves. Another couple of basic tips for using the Automatico: make use of hipfire where you can, that is to say where you have a weapon with good enough accuracy in its hipfire state at the given distance you're engaging. This will depend on the variant as well as how far your target is away from you. Always try to close the gap on your target, with the exception of a shotgun user. While AD spam does help with dealing with shotgun users, you're still better off with an Automatico at 25 meters against a shotgun user, because they will be already doing quite significantly less damage there, whereas you can still more or less accurately place your shots if you're aiming down sight. The last thing I'd like to note about the Automatico is that it is an aggressor's weapon. You should be the one engaging in firefights, getting on those objectives, taking on enemy players. You have so much firepower here that when you are in the correct engagement distance, there is little other than a huge amount of enemy players, so outnumbering, that can really stop you from winning a firefight if you've got a decent amount of accuracy. So the best playstyle for the Automatico, both for you as player and for your team, is to really get on those objectives, engage in firefights as frequently as you can, given that they're in the ideal engagement distance. Just make sure you don't get caught out in the open, because of course there, the Automatico will be of very little use to you. With the general advice out of the way then, what about the individual variants? How do they perform and how do they compare? We've already looked at their stats, but stats usually only present you with part of the picture. And this is also where I bring some of my personal experience and personal opinions into this discussion. In my opinion, while the factory is still a very good weapon, personally, I would always choose the Storm or the Trench variant over it. You could argue the factory is a middle ground between the Storm and the Trench preset, but in my opinion, all of these weapons in the end are close quarter, extreme close quarter for the fact, and I find myself being more effective with the Storm or the Trench preset. Speaking then of the Storm preset with its lower recoil is ideal for those of you playing maybe a game mode where engagement distances, despite being close quarter focused, sometimes tend towards the close medium range, where lower recoil, especially in the horizontal department, is going to mean that you're going to be able to extend your effective engagement distance of the Automatico past maybe 20, 25, 30 meters to maybe 5 or 10 meters more. Here, the Storm is the better version than the Trench or the Factory, because the lower recoil is noticeable, and the Storm is played ideally not necessarily hip firing other than in extreme close quarters, but by aiming down sight. It's an iron sight, so ADS times aren't too bad, and the recoil decrease that the Storm preset offers over the Trench and Factory variant are, in my opinion, significant enough that ADSing is actually a viable tactic. Because of this lower horizontal recoil, effectively the Storm, when aiming down sight, is the most accurate of the three Automatico variants. The second variant that I think is viable, or the better of the three available, is the Trench variant. Obviously the hipfire beast. Now hip firing is very strong in Battlefield 1, and the Trench variant is accumulation of bad weapon design in my opinion. It's simply, quite honestly, especially on PC, rather overpowered. The best way to use the Trench is obviously by hip firing it wherever you possibly can, other than in those medium range scenarios. However, often the engagement distance where hip firing isn't quite as viable anymore with the Trench is an engagement distance where soon the Storm preset would be the better choice. So just keep that in mind when choosing between the two. And another tip I'd like to give you generally for the Automatico, but more specifically for the Trench variant, is that hip firing while crouched, even while crouched and moving, is more accurate than hip fire while standing and moving, and is equally accurate to hip fire when you're standing but not moving. So a great way to get the maximum accuracy while hip firing out of your Automatico Trench is to slide about the place, making yourself a harder target, and hip firing while doing so. So sliding around the corner crouched, and hip firing away at your enemies is not only an extremely annoying tactic for your enemy, making you harder to hit and they may not expect it, but it's also very, very effective and will make your weapon not too inaccurate. After all, the trench variant of the Automatico does not have a first shot hip fire spread multiplier, meaning that your spread doesn't really extend beyond its base spread too quickly, whereas the Storm or the factory preset, which are aiming down sight, have an ADS jump to 0.57 on their second shot. So suddenly the trench variant, while hip firing in crouch mode, is not really that much less accurate than the Storm or factory variant while aiming down sight. With that in mind, I'd love to hear your opinion on the Automatico Trench on this matter, so leave your experiences with the weapon and of course your usual video suggestions down below in the comments or hit me up with them on Twitter. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and with that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.